I don't know if I shared this with you at previous gatherings, but I've taught online asynchronously for 14 years prior to the pandemic, and actually have a master's degree in instructional technology, which is what instructional designers typically have, and have published several articles on asynchronous online instruction, including how to improve, like strategies for improving interaction and social presence in online environments. So, but when remote learning arrived in March, I experienced it largely as a parent because I was on research leave. And learning how to navigate Seesaw, Google Classroom, the endless educational apps for elementary students was a different experience for me. And as all of you know, Zoom became a default platform for connecting not only professionally, but personally with our families and friends. And it definitely provided a way to connect and to interact. But I think, you know, it's, as we all know, it's not the same as face-to-face. And the problem was that I saw was that some of the school districts were doing just that, like trying to recreate face-to-face classes via Zoom. And an extreme example, but one that was true, in one school district in North Carolina where my niece and nephew live, they were going to be on Zoom from 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And the school district actually told parents to purchase blue light glasses for their kids, acknowledging that this is going to take a heavy toll on their eyesight, staring at a screen for essentially 3.5 hours. Our school district was much more reasonable. They had a 30 to 45-minute morning meeting in the morning. And then my daughter, who's in 3rd grade, had 2 other sessions later, but 30-minute sessions. My son, who was in 1st grade, it was largely asynchronous. So the teachers uploaded instructional videos and had assignments for them to do. And that was allowed for much more flexibility. But I was struck by this context of my niece and nephew because it really kind of overlooked the fact that Zoom fatigue is real. So the research shows that, like Jeremy Bailenson, the founding director of Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab, argues that the fatigue actually results from several factors. One is excessive amounts of close-up gaze. So if you look at other people's squares in front of you, what you're experiencing is typically like much closer than you would be with another person when you're interacting with them face to face. So this is already kind of hard for us to navigate. I mean, it's unconscious, subconscious, but having that close-up gaze is taxing in and of itself. But it also increases the cognitive load. So for instance, in gallery mode, when you're jumping from face to face, it's a lot to process. Although Zoom does have the hide self-view feature, I think typically we all have ourselves on the screen, and that heightens our own self-evaluation. And then finally, it constrains our physical mobility. So we have this more sedentary life. They've also shown that it affects our sense of social connection. Why? Because if I really want to look at you, I'm staring at this camera. I'm not actually looking at any of your faces. But if I actually look at your faces where I see you on the screen, you experience it as me looking away from you. So I'm not actually connecting with you as a human, as if we were going to have a face-to-face conversation. So that's difficult, right? You can't align your faces on the screen. There's also, and this is fascinating, there's this millisecond audio delays in responses that also have a negative impact on our interpersonal perceptions. So all of these can contribute to what we experience as Zoom fatigue. But one and so this is all kind of playing into my thoughts about what should the role of technology be in teaching and learning. And I'm very much persuaded by Derek Bruff, who wrote this book, Intentional Tech, but many others in the field of scholarship on teaching and learning, that our teaching and learning goals should drive our technology use, not vice versa. So that we should ideally only use technologies when they serve a pedagogical purpose. And I think we all know of technologies, like Devin mentioned yesterday, there's Perusal, which is a way that you can socially annotate texts. So like comment on text together. That's an interesting, especially for us in the study of religion, where you want students to read text together. That's a useful technology for accomplishing a goal if we want our students together to analyze texts. Another technology that I'm more familiar with is e-portfolios, partly because when I was directing our university's general education program, I coordinated our e-portfolio platform and program. And e-portfolios are really useful for having students reflect on their learning. So it's basically a digital repository of their work from their undergraduate career, and they can make connections, synthesizing between their work across courses, or even connect across coursework and extracurricular activity. But they could also, collect this and do this kind of portfolio offline. I mean, the advantage of having it online is it's in one space, but it comes with costs and benefits, right? As any technology does. So many of these e-portfolio platforms, for instance, if the university has a subscription, once students graduate, sometimes they have, the students have to subscribe and pay for the continuity of their e-portfolio. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And another thing, and this is a theory that you may all be familiar with, and it's become pretty central in the field of scholarship on teaching and learning, is the idea of backward design of learning. And this is the idea that we should actually start with our end goal in mind. So we should identify the results that we want to see. What do we want our students 5 to 10 years out to actually have taken away from our course? And this, sometimes they refer to it as a big idea, or it could be a skill, for instance, public speaking or writing, something that you want them to transfer, to take away into their lives after they graduate. Once you identify that, then you try to align it with the evidence. And I know when you hear the word assessment, you might all groan, but the idea is like, what would serve as evidence that they've actually achieved the goal that you wanted them to achieve? And that's the end goal in mind, right? So you start with the first, you have the sense of how they would demonstrate that learning. And then you plan your learning experiences and your instruction to get them from that point to the other. And so this is kind of it's a very basic framework, but it actually underlies a lot of online instruction design. So there's this organization, Quality Matters. It's an important organization for online instruction. And that's essentially one of the most important things that they emphasize, that you want to make sure that students know how the learning goals in your course are aligned with the way that you're assessing them, and also the activities that they do in the course, even by making it very explicit, like including a course map in your online course learning management system, for instance, saying, you're going to do this activity, you're going to turn in this is the goal that it aligns with, this is why I'm having you do what you do. And that's something that's interesting and has come up a lot in sort of discussions about transparency and learning and teaching. There's a website, Tilt, in higher education, and they actually make the argument, the case, that we need to be, as instructors, much more explicit about the purpose, the tasks, and the criteria for every assignment that we have our students do. And actually it's important because of equity reasons. So first generation students, particular populations of students, they've done research and shown if you make this very explicit, they perform much better because they know what the expectations are. So instead of a few sentence prompt, if you actually lay out, this is the purpose of why I'm having you do this, these are the steps, like step by step, what you would need to do to complete this assignment. And this is the criteria that I'm evaluating on. It makes things very transparent, and then it leads to greater student success. So essentially, that's the main idea. It's like, what are your learning goals? You're probably very familiar with this graphic, the Bloom's taxonomy. But what I want us to reflect on as a group, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity for discussion, is like, what is Zoom good for? And I guess preliminary thoughts on my behalf, it is good for breakout sessions, and this came out in our previous sessions. The breakout groups allow students the opportunity to interact with a small group of other people, and they can, and so for that sort of learning, that's very helpful. Also for like one-on-one or question and answer sessions. So for instance, meeting with a student one-on-one about a paper or project that they're doing, it can be quite useful. And then obviously for group work activity, that can be very helpful as well. But notice that it's not helpful for everything. And I would make the argument that especially during a pandemic scenario, that having most of our activities, our learning activities asynchronous actually allows for more flexibility for our students. And so things to think about if you are going to integrate Zoom, that there are strategies for mitigating against Zoom fatigue. And we've seen it in our conference here, right? So breaking Zoom sessions into chunks of activities so that we're not constantly staring at the screen, having breaks so people can step away, perhaps having your students do short written reflections where they're actually writing with pen and paper, they're not having to look at the screen. And then as we all experience, like grounding exercises, and these don't have to be incorporating mindfulness, but for instance, when students come in, having a moment of reflection, perhaps on what they've read, or I mean, if you want to check in with your students about how they're doing. And as the daughter of an ophthalmologist, this is probably the only opportunity I'll have in a presentation that I give to actually bring up ophthalmological research. But there's this 20-20-20 rule that says for every 20 minutes you spend looking at a screen, you should spend 20 full seconds looking at an object about 20 feet away from you. So if you think about it, after every presentation, ideally, we should have been looking off in the distance, giving our eyes the opportunity to kind of reset before we stare back at our screens. So that's just a practical tidbit to take with you from here on out. So you can sort of say, if anyone asks you why you're gazing off in the distance, there's this 20-20-20 rule, and it's actually the Ophthalmological Association. So there's research that's behind this. But one thing that I do want us to think about, like what counts as presence in Zoom, like do you think? And I thought about this from the perspective of me as a teacher. Like ideally, I want all my students to have their videos turned on and for them to look engaged, but that's not the reality, right? So, well, is logged in, is that what we want our students to be on Zoom? Or do we really want the cameras on? Or maybe comments made, like that they're typing in chat or they're speaking, or perhaps interacting and responding to each other. And then this is where we get at Segal's presentation. I mean, our expectations such that ideally we don't want our students multitasking or giving their partial attention to what's going on. And I think if we do want that, then we want to really think seriously about what we're having our students Zoom for. And for instance, if we're going to give a presentation, maybe making that available asynchronously, and then really kind of putting more effort into when we're on Zoom, this is why we're on Zoom, this is what we're using it for. And I think again of my son who, he'd bring a book in and he just kind of just put it right there below the camera. And so his teacher would count him as present, but he was reading on his own. And so, I mean, and then there's the flip side, right? A lot of us have brought up Foucault and discipline and the panopticon, and obviously our role, I mean, do we really want to be monitoring, who's paying attention, so it's kind of, I've found this to be tricky in using Zoom in my own classes. And I'll just say that I only had one class that met synchronously, all the rest have been asynchronous, but it's been a challenge for the synchronous class, especially because it was a first-year seminar. So they're coming in, there were high schoolers that experienced remote learning in the spring, but really kind of came in, and then the expectation was actually this is a seminar, and they don't really know what a seminar is, and I'm trying to recreate a kind of seminar feel via this platform. So, and I didn't require that they turn their cameras on. I naively thought, well, obviously they'll want to be engaged and looking at each other and talking with each other. And so, and then there's also concerns. We were told, you have to be very flexible with the students. They might be in an environment where they don't feel comfortable turning their cameras on. And so there's all these sorts of factors that kind of contribute to this, what we want in our Zoom environments. But what I have found is that, if we want to prioritize presence, it really should call for a learner-centered approach. So putting our students at the center of the learning experience. And in online environments, especially asynchronous ones, it means soliciting their feedback early on in the semester, and then often. That actually for students is a sign that you're present. They think of you as being present if you are interacting with them this way and asking for their feedback. Also meeting with them individually whenever possible. but really intentionally designing our classes so that we afford them options and choices. And this actually draws from trauma-informed pedagogy. The more choices that you provide your students, it's more supportive of them. And another thing that comes from trauma-informed pedagogy is creating a predictable, a consistent learning environment and a supportive learning community. So making it clear, like every 2 weeks, this is the kind of routine that you will have. That kind of consistency and predictability actually really helps. So this actually draws from research on online instruction. And one of the central ideas in that research is called the community of inquiry model. And this is drawing from Garrison, Anderson, and Archer. And they talk about 3 different types of presence. One is social presence. So providing plenty of opportunities for learners to interact, to discuss, and collaborate with each other. That's really central for creating social presence in your course. Again, teaching presence is largely continuous formative feedback, letting students know how they're doing in the course. So that does mean having opportunities for them to get a sense of how they're doing early on in the semester. And then finally, cognitive presence is really about how the learner interacts with the content. And so this is really, it's crucial to have, if, for instance, if you're having a discussion board, making sure your questions are very open-ended, they're exploratory, so that they can kind of promote critical thinking for students. So tying this all up, how does this connect with my research on moral attention? Well, as Segal pointed out, for Simone Weil, it really starts with a simple training of attention, and she associated this with school studies. Solving a math problem, you're really engaged in that math problem. And that's a particular form of attention that you can then develop into a moral attention, where you're attending to morally salient information in the surrounding situation or people around you. But what do we want our students to attend to, for instance, in a Zoom setting? Is it the speaker? Is it the group? Is it the topic? In which case, maybe they're not really directly thinking about this. They're trying to absorb what the speaker's saying, but really thinking about the topic, or even their own thoughts, their own feelings, and sort of internally more attentive to what's happening within them. And, is that best done with cameras on or cameras off? And so what I've found is that sometimes it's helpful for me to think about how I'm facilitating presence offline, in an online environment. And so drawing from contemplative learning, I found that especially, and I taught a course on mindfulness to retirees, so 50, 60, and 70-year-olds. And they found it quite transformative during the isolation of COVID to be able to communicate, but also this notion of mindful communication, of really stepping back and trying to speak across differences, trying to listen, to hear what to understand. So listen to understand and speak to be understood. These kinds of principles of communicating in this kind of mindful way really resonated with them. But I've also incorporated a lot of experiential learning so that students apply the content to their everyday life. That's very helpful, I found, in online learning environments. And then finally, somatic learning. So I've had a lot of colleagues emphasize this as well. And Natasha mentioned this, that she's taken up tennis herself during COVID, right? We all want to kind of try to balance the sedentary lifestyles that we have. And one way that I found is that providing opportunities, for instance, if you have podcasts or ways for students to listen and walk, get out and move around and learn in that way, can also be very helpful. So thank you so much, and I enjoy and look forward to our discussion.